What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another video on our series of going from zero to hero in Cadence development. I haven't said that one in a while. And in this video, we're going to be talking about optional binding and some cool stuff with optionals that you can do, which I personally use all the time. So unlike the last video with enums, where I was saying that I don't really use that much, I use this all the time. So I think it's really important to teach in the Cadence ecosystem. So what we're going to be doing today is, like I said, just learning some cool stuff about optionals. So in order to do that, I've launched a Flow Playground, and we're really just going to be working in a script here just to sort of get our bearings. So all I've done so far is I open up a script and I defined a new struct called test. And inside test is just a number, and I initialize the number to something. So why don't we actually change this so that we can pass in a number here inside our init function. So like that. So what we can do now is we can just say, to get rid of these arrows, let's just return our number for now. And let's go ahead and say let test be a test that equals test, and we'll pass in like 10 or something, right? So right now, if we were to return test.number, right, we're just returning an int, and so if we execute this, we're just going to get 10 in the console, right? So this is pretty straightforward. You know this already. This is all about structs. But let's say that we started to introduce optionals now. And let's say that for some use case, let's just say that this test struct was an optional type. And we wanted to return an int question mark. So if you think about, if you're developing like a real world application, a lot of the times in your scripts, you don't want to ever panic, or you don't want to force unwrap something using this operator. Because if you do that, then your Cadence script is going to abort. It's going to cause some errors on your client, whatever it is. So usually what you want to do in a real world application is use optionals so that on your client side, you can check if it's nil and handle it in that case. Or if it's not nil, you do some other case, right? So a lot of the times in your real world projects, you'll be returning optionals a bunch. So we're going to go over an example of that in this case. So let's say that we have a test that's it's an optional test struct, and we're going to initialize it to test, right? So obviously it's not nil in this case, but it's going to give us a problem. It's going to say when we return test.number, it's going to say value of test has no member number. So in this case, what we could do is unwrap it, force unwrap it. And so if you imagine in some different use case where we're not doing this very simple example, but you have some struct in your contract, you get this from your contract, right? And then you force unwrap it. You don't really want to do that, because what's going to happen is it's going to panic if this test doesn't exist. Now, obviously, in this case, we know it's not nil because we're seeing it right here, but that might not always be the case, right? So what we can do instead is use this question mark operator, or this question mark here. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, okay, and by the way, I want to point out that in this case, when we use the force unwrap, we can specify the return type as an int, not an int optional, because the force unwrap will never return an optional. But what we could do is change this to a question mark so that we can return an int optional. And what this is going to say is we're going to go to the test struct. If it's not nil, we're going to return .number. But if it is nil, then we're going to return nil. So this allows you to do this sort of returning without having to say something like this, like if test equals nil, then return nil. Otherwise, so else, return test.number, right? And then unwrap it like that. So instead of doing this, where we say if test is nil, return nil. If test is not nil, in this else case, return the number. We can replace all of this by literally just saying return test question mark .number, and it will handle all of that for us. So that's actually a really helpful thing that we can do. So I'm gonna just put this comment here so that we see we don't have to do that anymore. All right, awesome. So that's one thing in Cadence I really wanted to go over, because this is super important, and you'll probably see this a bunch in your actual when you start coding out some real world stuff. I can't say that word. Oh my god. All right. So the next part I want to go over is optional binding. Now, optional binding is probably even more important than this, and it's really just a shortcut, but I use it all the time in my Cadence scripts. And one more example, by the way, before we go to optional binding, let's look at another example that you're going to use more often, probably. But in this case, we have a test struct, the same test struct, right? The same exact thing. And we have a main function here. And inside of here, instead of just having one test struct, we have a dictionary. So the dictionary is int to test, and all it does is it just maps the integer, the number that's in the test, to the test itself. So like 10 to test 10, 20 to test 20. And here, you know, we're not really dealing with it. We're not really dealing with it with a test optional. We're dealing with dictionaries. Now, remember, dictionaries return optionals, so this won't work, right? If we try to do this, it's going to say value of type test question mark has no member number, and that's because again, when you access elements of a dictionary, it returns an optional. So in order to fix this, what we can do is put the question mark here again, and then dot number. And so this is saying if test at 20 exists, then return the number. If it doesn't exist, return nil. That's just another helpful example. All right. So now let's talk about optional binding. So if we go to another script, let's just copy and paste what we have like over here, for example. So let's just take this. Cool. So optional binding, I guess, in a nutshell, I'm just removing the errors here. Optional binding in a nutshell is really a way for us to say, if something is not nil, then we want to actually use that value. And if it is nil, then we don't want to use that value. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's actually do an example. So inside of our test, let's add a public var, I don't know, like fruits or something. And let's just do like an array of strings. So inside of our init, we'll just say like self.fruits equals apples. That's a fruit, right? Bananas. And that's it. Okay, so we'll just put those two for example. So let's say that we take our dictionary here and we put it right here. Okay. So what is optional binding? Well, optional binding is essentially this. So if I'm going to write it out first, then I'll explain it. So if let s equals s at n, like so, else so. So optional binding is essentially any time you see if let, that is optional binding right there. And what this is saying is it's going to say if test at 10 is not nil, so meaning there's a value there, go and do this if statement and bind this test variable to that result. But if test at 10 is nil, then go into the else statement. So what we can do here is we can actually log test and then log like is nil if we get to this part. But you'll see that if we run this script, execute it, you'll see it's actually going to log test here because it binded test to this variable. And so you'll see it logged it down here. Now, it might not make sense where this is helpful, but what we can actually do is say, so if we wanted to like read this array, for example, we can say, okay, if test at 10 is not nil, then we want to log test dot fruits at 0, for example. Let's just say that. So if we execute this, then it's going to say apples. So you can see what basically the point of this is that if something is not nil, we can bind a variable to it and then use that variable inside the if statement. And that's the whole point of optional binding, is to get to assign or bind a variable to a non-nil value so that we can then use that variable somewhere else. And that's why it's really important right here. And so, you know, what we could do is if we wanted to like return a string, for example, we could, you know, return nil here, and just not do any of this. It would, let's just say return like so. And so you'll see that it'll actually return here. Now, some of you may be saying, well, didn't I just explain previously why we shouldn't do this sort of like if nil, if not nil type of thing? The answer is yes, but the problem is that in this case, you can't really use question mark on like arrays and dictionaries. So if we were to go back here and say like, let's just comment this out for a second. Let's just comment this out for a second and say return tests at 10 question mark dot fruits at 0. You'll see it doesn't work, and it says cannot index into value, which is type string question mark. So the problem here is that you know, we can't take a struct optional and then dot into it. Like we can't go into it, so you can't really use it that way. But that's where optional binding comes in and says, okay, if we want to get some sort of variable inside our test struct, if it's not nil, then we can assign the variable and then return something that has to do with that variable inside of here. So I want to actually show you guys a real life example of this. So I went and copy and pasted the NBA Top Shots from our contract here, and let's look at a real life example of if let. So I guess, are there multiple examples? Okay, so there's multiple examples of it, but what we're going to look at is this if let play equals topshot.play data. So if we go and look at, let's go all the way to the top actually, and look at, there's a field called play datas. So this is just a dictionary that maps an integer to a play struct, and they store it in play datas. So if we go back and look at the if let, you'll see they do topshot.play datas at that number, at a certain number, and that returns an optional, right? Because you're indexing into a dictionary. But what they do is they say if let play, so they bind this play variable to that example, and then they return that play.metadata field if it's not nil, and if it is nil, they just return the nil here. That's one example of it. You can see another example of it here. If let set data, they bind the set data variable to whatever optional this returns, and if it is nil, then they return nil here. So that's just a helpful example of optional binding in a real life example. Like I said before, I use optional binding pretty much every single day when I'm coding in Cadence, so just thought this would be a helpful video for all of you. So thanks for tuning in for another video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.